So a few weeks ago, I did a video on Kant and the critique of pure reason and the interests of reason and how that can tell us something about how we should be behaving as spirits consumers. And I really made that video because I felt like I owed something to Kant. But to my shock and delight, people loved it. Like, the comments were lit up. Like, people just really, really liked me talking about the critique of pure reason for some reason. So we're going to do it again, but we're not going to do Kant. We're going to do another, extremely well-known, but often, misinterpreted philosopher. We're going to talk about Descartes. And we're not going to talk about the Descartes of the Discourse on Method, the Meditations, the Descartes everyone knows. Well, I'm going to have to dip into the Meditations a little bit. We're going to talk about the passions of the soul. This extremely weird last work that he wrote. I mean, he literally died a few months after he had this thing published. And no one... how do I put this? Okay, so let me give you a little trade secret, a little hint. Why is philosophy hard to read? It's not because the arguments are particularly tricky or anything. They can be sometimes. A lot of the difficulty just comes down to knowing, like, why does this exist? Why did someone sit down and write this thing? What problems is it supposed to be solving? And it's really hard to figure out why Descartes wrote the Passions of the Soul. I mean, you can just say, well, like, he was friends with Elizabeth of Bohemia and she asked him to write it. Okay, that's an answer, but maybe you can do better. So I want to talk about the Passions of the Soul, and I want to talk about how that applies to reflection through enjoying good spirits. We'll get there in a second. Instantly, the word soul, mind and soul in this period, we're talking about 1650 or so. Take them as more or less equivalent. Soul should not be taken immediately as a spooky, new agey term. I mean, all this is coming out of Aristotle. In Aristotle, soul just means something like the principle of self-movement. And a lot of the debates that come out of that just amount to how spooky do you have to take that. So, all right, we're going to actually start with the Meditations for a second. So there's this moment in the letter to the Sorbonne that opens the Meditations, where Descartes mentions, he refers back to the 8th session of the Lateran Council, where he mentions that the Lateran Council was this incredibly long, huge meeting of the church that started in 1512 or so and went on for years and years and years and years. And one of the things that happened during this was basically an edict issued right at the tail end of 1513 that condemned a number of heretical positions on the immortality of the soul. In this case, Descartes mentions the idea that the soul, that there might be persuasive grounds that the soul dies along with the body, and the opposite view is based on faith alone. And that in this same edict, the Pope sends good Christians off to define good philosophical arguments against this view. And Descartes sort of raises his hand and says, "Hi, I am here. I am here to do the job." What the heck is this all about? Okay, so it's relatively well agreed among researchers that this decree from the Lateran Council was targeting one particular individual and his group of friends. That character was Pietro Pomponazzi. All right, I have to explain a little bit about Aristotelianism and, I guess, theological psychology as it was going on in Italy around the 16th century. Are you having fun yet? We're 5 minutes in and we're already having fun. All right, so you had this debate between the old school Thomas Aquinas guys, and the Platonists were right there as well. because remember, like Plato had just been published for the first time in Western Europe in its entirety a couple of years before this, so Plato was hot right now. But anyways, the Thomists and the Platonists were kind of united in this very classical view that upon that sort of God instills a soul into a body, that is what makes it alive, and upon the death of the body, the soul is immortal and it goes on to do its soully things. So there's a kind of personal immortality involved. You personally, you as the person you are, get to go on and survive the death of your body. They were in debate, and hotly contested debate with the Averroists, who thought of themselves as much more hardcore Aristotelians. And the thought there was, well, it's still, we can still agree that there is a soul, and that everyone agreed at this point there was a soul, because again, it's just principle of movement, principle of self-movement, but that the soul is immortal, but it's in a particular sense. The Averroists wanted to hold that upon the death of the body, what the soul is, the rational soul in any case, is just a sort of particularly embodied aspect of intellect, capital I. And intellect in that sense is not a count noun. There are not intellects. There is one big intellect, and you're just kind of one manifestation of it. Upon the death of the body, there is no personal immortality. Your manifestation just rejoins intellect, big I. So there's this big honking debate between all these folks. And Pietro Pomponazzi and a couple of other folks around him, he wasn't actually the first to publish this. In fact, the edict condemning what he was doing happened before he published his main text. Pietro Pomponazzi, with his own circle, went back to Aristotle, and they read the text, and they found an argument. This is in Pomponazzi's big famous book on the immortality of the soul, so 1516 or so. Chapter 9, he presents his own position. He talks a lot about how the soul is supposed to be between the intellective and the sensitive. We occupy this kind of in-between place, and he draws upon scripture and all that to kind of support this, because we're in the Renaissance. That's what you do. And then he quotes Aristotle. He goes back to Aristotle. He goes back to De Anima. Where's the text? Give me a second. So he's quoting the Psalms, and he says, "Thou hast established him above the works of thy hands, the sheep and the oxen, etc." And this way of knowing is that of which Aristotle speaks in De Anima. If knowing is either imagination or not without imagination, it is impossible for it to exist without a body. And when in De Anima he declares that knowing is not without imagination, since it is not through an organ, and it cannot be without imagination. And in the same texts he says, the soul does not know it all without some phantasm. I need to explain this. Okay, so in Aristotle, in De Anima, all perception is done through these things called phantasms, which are basically generated by the imagination. These are intermediaries for perceiving or knowing anything. Right? Fair enough? Anything the soul does on the kind of Aristotelian perception or take requires these phantasms. Phantasms are generated by the imagination. Imagination is based in the body. So it starts to really look like when the body dies, ain't no imagination anymore, ain't no phantoms anymore. The mind can't think anymore. The mind can't do any of the stuff that we normally associate with mindedness. You got that? You got that argument? This argument, I'm going to repeat it one more time. So the argument is, you're going back to Aristotle. All thinking happens basically by way of imagination. Not that we're imagining everything. It's a different sense of imagination. But through imagination. Imagination requires body. Whence, when the body dies, there's nothing we can use to do that kind of thinking anymore. This argument is This is like the choke slam of like Renaissance rational psychology arguments. This is hard. This is a Chad move. I mean, as just as a bonus, you're going up to the Thomists and the Averroists who think that Aristotle is their guy, who think that he's on their side, and showing them no, he's actually got a view which might be diametrically opposed to yours. And in fact, Pomponazzi seems to think that Aristotle's own view is just that the soul dies along with the body. Incidentally, that doesn't mean you could have that view and still be a Christian in some sense. There's a long, kind of often forgotten but proud history of Christian materialists. Go read Hobbes. These folks tend to lean a lot on that whole resurrection of the body thing. Anyways, Pomponazzi wants to say this is where Aristotle is going. Now, he himself doesn't go this way because he would get in trouble, or more trouble than he already would. And he's too good a philosopher to just say, hey, body dies, mind dies along with it. What he says is, you haven't ruled out the possibility that the mind kind of continues, but it's sort of inert. It can't do any of the stuff we normally. We have no way of conceiving what mind would even be upon the death of the body in that sense. So Pomponazzi says at the very end of this book, after he's just torn apart all the Aristotelians in Italy at the time, that ultimately, what does he say? These things, we must say that the question of the immortality of the soul is a neutral problem. What he means is that you can't decide between these two possibilities. Like, if you take Aristotle seriously on this stuff, it could be that soul just dies along with the body. It could be that soul continues on, but in a way where it can't like do thinking anymore. So it isn't really what it was. And there's no way of deciding in between these two, short of appealing to divine revelation, church doctrine, all that stuff. And that is what Lateran, the Eighth Council Lateran, condemns. And this is what Descartes is going after in the Meditations. So there's some context for you. All right. So I'm going to get to the point in a little bit. Hang on. Okay. So Descartes takes it to be his job to rescue Christendom or something, the church, from the threat of Pomponazzi and particularly Aristotle. And so what do you have to do to beat that argument, that monster of an argument? You have to find some way of thinking about the mind, something that the mind can do that we can, grab a hold of, conceive of, that does not depend upon, or doesn't immediately seem to depend upon, embodiment. There has to be something. There has to be some way of distinguishing mind from body. That is the question. Maybe if you can do that, then you can save, all the personal immortality stuff that the Platonists and the Thomists and Rome wanted to save. So, I don't want to talk in detail about the Meditations. So you're reading along. You're reading along the Meditations. You know this stuff, right? You read it in college or whatever. And you have to systematically doubt everything. We cannot trust the senses. It turns out we can't even trust the truths of mathematics. So you keep reading. You get to Meditation 2. I will actually check the text on this. It's just a moment. So we are going even beyond not doubting the truths of mathematics. We are inventing a character, a malevolent spirit that is systematically tricking us with every possible judgment we can make. And Descartes says, I have no senses and no body. What follows from this? Am I not so bound up with the body and with senses that I absolutely cannot exist without them? So now you can question yourself how, especially as you read further into Meditations, how far he can really grant himself saying that he has no body in this case. But I convince myself there's absolutely nothing in the world. Does it not now follow that I too do not exist? No, if I convince myself, if I persuaded myself of anything, then I certainly existed. This is, so it's not, this argument is not it's not a syllogism. I mean, the initial statement, I think therefore I am, is not his best statement of the argument. What he's saying here is to be persuaded that there is no world and that there is no body. That itself is an act. It is a particular kind of act, and that is enough to say there has to be some thing, some little nugget that is doing that act. That's the argument. It's not a syllogism. It's just an act. And it's important to notice as you're reading this how little that actually gets Descartes. It doesn't there's no question of duration here. Like it's just an act. That's all it is. It's just, and at this point, the mind, the thinking thing, is just whatever is performing that act. It's a function. It has no personality, no history, no nothing. There's nothing to it. And in fact, when he tries to use imagination and all this other stuff to try to understand what this thinking thing is, it's a complete failure. Like, the only way to grasp it is just in terms of this little nugget performing an act. That's all he can do at that point. But it's interesting. Like, so if I am persuaded of something, then I certainly existed. What is he persuaded of? It's doubt. The first act that provides a foundation for science in this text is doubting. It's sort of, and it's not even a doubting of anything particular. It's a generalized doubt that only sort of comes to meet resistance when it's turned upon itself, where it's sort of doubting its own doubting. That is the only, so that is all the content you get at this book at this point. And it isn't really until you get to Meditation 4 when you can finally sort of fill out like what that doubt really is. So in Meditation 4, you introduce the will, and Descartes explained, basically in a really quick and kind of unsatisfying way, that really this doubt we've been performing along with all the other stuff that he lists out in Meditation 2, is really an act of the will, and the will is infinite. It isn't infinite in the sense that we can do anything we want, but in the sense that it's just saying yes or no, and it's yesing and knowing. That's all the will is. But at that level, it is the equal of God. It is absolutely divine. And Descartes wants to say that at some level, we are able to distinguish that will as something distinct, a way of cognizing, of thinking, which is distinct from embodiment, which doesn't require phantasms in the same way as you would find in Aristotle. That's the argument. So it's quite clever. You have Pomponazzi, being a good classical kind of scholastic Aristotelian that he was, never really put will on the map of the stuff to consider in this, because he was just thinking about perceptions and knowing and all that good old stuff. Descartes, what he's doing here is he's saying, no, you forgot something. You forgot about the yesing and knowing, and that is enough for him to, he thinks at least, to draw a distinction between the substance of mind, the thinking thing, and body, the extended thing. Now it gets much more complicated than that when you finally get to Meditation 6, but that is where things go. But you'll notice that doesn't actually get him. So he has done the impossible. He's actually survived, Pomponazzi's chokeslam, or at least he thinks he does. He has found a mode of thinking that got missed by Aristotle and Pomponazzi. But you will remember the question that this was supposed to solve was that whole immortality thing, the immortality of the soul. And it's a bit weird because outside of the preface and the summary that open the meditations, he never mentions immortality in the entire text. And this is brought up to him in the second set of replies written by his friend Mersenne. Because remember, the Meditations, the book that was published, isn't just the Meditations. It's an entire collection of objections made by other philosophers, solicited by Descartes, and Descartes' replies to him. So it's really an anthology. I don't think anyone outside of philosophy nerds like myself really think of it that way, but that's what it is. So second set of objections, Mersenne kind of makes this point, hey, bro, you forgot to talk about immortality. Listen to what Descartes says in response. You go on to say, it does not follow from the fact that the soul is distinct from the body that it is immortal, since it could still be claimed that God gave it such a nature that its duration comes to an end simultaneously with the end of the body's life. Here I admit I cannot refute what you say, for I do not take it upon myself to try to use the power of human reason to settle any of those matters which depend on the free will of God. So he says, basically, bro, what am I supposed to say? He goes on like this. He says we don't have convincing evidence that any substance can perish, really. But then, if your question concerns the absolute power of God, then it is for God alone to answer. And since God himself has revealed to us that this will not occur, there remains not even the slightest room for doubt on this point. So in other words, he's gone through this whole rigmarole of I am responding to the Lateran Council's plea for help. I am going to take it to Pomponazzi. He thinks he's found this mode of thinking that, gets him out of the Pomponazzian argument. And at the end, he lands in exactly the same position. We can, have good hopes that the mind survives the death of the body, but ultimately the only confirmation we have is he says God having revealed himself that he's done this. So we're back on revelation, sacred doctrine, church teaching, scripture, all that stuff. So Descartes does not actually solve the problem. All right, I'm 23 minutes in. I haven't even started on the passions of the soul yet, but we're going to move on. Keep all of this as background. But what you have is this new character in the play, which is the will. And this is where things get interesting 5 years after the Meditations. All right, so passions of the soul. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. Come on. Where is it? Okay. So one of the things the passions of the soul, as the text gives you, is a completely new classification of how to think about the faculties of the mind, of thinking, than you get in the Meditations, which is already super important. All right, so this is section 17. I'm just going to skip a lot of these. So one thing you have to accept about this text is there's a lot of 17th century neurobiology, which is not accurate and actually very, very funny. So when Spinoza makes fun of Descartes for thinking that it's the pineal gland that connects the body and the mind, rightly so. Spinoza had every right to take that shot. This is the text where that stuff is in there. So I don't think it's the philosophically interesting stuff. Here's the stuff that I think is philosophically interesting. So in section 17, Descartes starts to give you a new breakdown of the different faculties of the soul, right? And he breaks it into, it's no longer the kind of laundry list you get in meditation too. It's now actions and passions. And the way you distinguish this is basically which direction is the causality going in terms of these cognitions. If the cognition is caused by the mind, it's an action. If it's caused by the body, it's a passion. In the broad sense. There's also a much narrower sense of the passion of the soul, which he's going to get to in a little bit. So he talks about the will. He went back to the will. And the will has kind of taken over a huge amount of territory in the Cartesian. He says it's not just like willing to, say, move my body, willing to think about something. It also includes stuff like, he says, applying our mind to some object which is not material. So thinking about ourselves as thinking things. That is an act of the will now. That used to be the understanding in the meditations, but now the will has kind of assimilated the understanding into itself. And willing upon the body, there's a kind of active imagination he talks about. So willing to get the imagination to produce images for us. And then there's passions. And passions are, he further distinguishes passions in terms of, so the translation is a little bit misleading here. He says that what makes the distinction in all the perceptions is they differ. He says they differ from one another insofar as the translation is refer these things to different things. Refer is not the word. The French verb is rapporter, which is report. So to reference is to point to something. It's a very particular philosophical term. I'm over here. I'm pointing over there. Report. What's going on is not that. The picture is I am getting a report from what is happening over there. So information is coming from here back to me, and the difference is where what the information is reporting, basically, not what is referring to. Anyway, so some perceptions, so passions, are just imaginary, hallucinations, whatever. Some refer to my body, some refer to outer objects, and then you have the passions of the soul in the particular sense. I'm going to read the definition. Sensations are emotions of the soul which refer particularly to it, and which are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movements of the spirit, so the nervous system, basically. This is, okay, think about this for a second. This kind of cognition is passive, so it's generated by the body. But what it reports, what it gives information about, is the mind, the soul. Think about that for a second. Like, you imagine when you consider, introspection, self-reflection, that it's a kind of, active intellectual act. But for Descartes, no, absolutely not. Like, this is, if you want information about your soul, you have to do it through, the state of your soul, so to speak. You have to do it passively, which means the body has to be generating it. And that is really, really interesting. So what is the takeaway of this? I mean, there's much more discussion about this, about there's a classification of the individual passions. I'm not going to go into all that. I think it's interesting, but I think the takeaway for the purposes of this silly video is right in this point, that it is passive thinking that tells us about the state of our mind, about ourselves, really, and not active thinking. So what are the takeaways? Well, first of all, so Descartes has this kind of ethical, moral project where he wants us to be able to, cultivate our passions. He doesn't want to eliminate passions. There's no kind of interest in that. But there is a strong interest in training ourselves to get a better relationship to our passions and our capacity for feeling. And that's important. And a lot of the text is about that. But there's two philosophically, for me, more interesting things going on here. The first is that passion of the soul, in this sense, is another mode of certainty, of truth. So go back to the meditations again for 1 second. In meditations, you get, I would say, 3 interrelated ways of reaching truth. You have the light of the rational light, the light of reason. You have clear and distinct perceptions. Those first 2 are not the same thing. You do not confuse those 2 things, because then you become one of those people who thinks the third meditation is just circular. It's not circular. That doesn't make it a good argument, but it's not circular. And then third, you have this kind of, I would call it the certainty of thinking, so there's this moment in the second meditation where he says, I seem to be seeing something, and it could be the thing is not there, but I can at least be certain that I seem to be seeing it. So there's a kind of reflexive certainty there that I know I am performing that act at that time. The passions of the soul goes even beyond that. Listen to this. So this is paragraph 26. So he talks about this same kind of sensory illusion thing. Pictures are sometimes so similar to the things that we represent that it may mislead us regarding the perceptions which refer to objects outside of us, or even regarding parts of our body. But we cannot be misled in the same way regarding the passions, in that they are so close and so internal to our soul that it cannot possibly feel them unless they are truly as it feels them to be. Even if we are asleep and dreaming, we cannot feel sad or moved by any other passion unless the soul truly has this passion within it. So it's not clear and distinct perception at all. This is a different mode of certainty entirely because it's passive. It might be clear, but it's not distinct. But nevertheless, it is absolutely a mode of certainty. If you feel any passion whatsoever, you're feeling it, and you cannot be misled about that. And then there's the third thing, which I think is interesting. And this goes a little bit further on. He points out, this is a couple of discussions centering around paragraph 39, that one and the same cause can excite different passions in different people. And he says, he gives the example, the same impression which the presence of a terrifying object forms and causes fear in some people may excite courage and boldness in others. The reason for this is that brains are not all constituted in the same way. So the difference between people's reactions to different kinds of passions and different kinds of stimulus, prompting those passions, is bodily. It's in the brain, and that's not to say that the brain is some cannot be changed in any way at all. It's of course it can be changed. The entire project of this book, at least as he's presenting it, is the work of cultivating passions, getting better at how to respond to them, learning how to control them. But the point is that what makes us different, what gives us personality, it's not the mind as a distinct substance. It's not the soul. It's the brain. It's the body, or rather the unity of the soul with the body. That is what makes us who we are. That is what gives us individuality. So it's a little bit paradoxical, but Descartes, starting on the path of kind of trying to refute Pomponazzi, and if anything, ends up in a much more radical position than Pomponazzi as regards our sort of dependence upon the body. Pomponazzi still has this picture that even if the soul post-death ends up kind of inert and unable to think in the normal ways we would think of it, the rational side of the mind is still driving the bus in some reason. It's still, that is who we are. Our rationality is who we are. Descartes, in developing this very particular picture of will, working on will comes to this very paradoxical place here, which is the exact opposite conclusion. Because the will in Descartes is empty. It's anonymous. It's just a function that could be taken up by anyone whatsoever. It's empty. There's no content there. There's no you there. And it is the part of you that is divine, that is the equal of the gods, and it's completely empty. What makes you the person that you are, what makes us the people that we are, is not that sort of divine part of us. It's our passions and our, I don't know, I don't even know how to say it, our tendencies and our relationships towards the passions. That is what makes us who we are on this Cartesian view. And I find that really surprising. Like, this is Descartes. This is supposed to be the arch rationalist, and this is his final position on all this. So there's a certain irony when characters like Vico and Rousseau later on try to, take pot shots, fire strays, as we now say, at Cartesian rationalism, because they do that on the basis of, or on a path that Descartes himself already laid out in this text. It's all here. Like that path continues on through Vico up to Romanticism and beyond. Like that kind of, I would say, tension and relationship between passions and will. Like, man, that has got a long history, long after Descartes. All right, let me have some water. Thank you for watching up to this point. What are we, 37 minutes? Oh, man. Okay. So what is the takeaway for this if you were a Spirits fan? What was I going to say? Okay, so self-reflection. And I'm just going to confirm something that I think many of us have kind of already appreciated. It's not like there's a certain kind of self-perception you can do by sort of eliminating the world, eliminating sensation. And what you end up with when you do that kind of self-reflection, self-reflective work, is you discover that in some sense you're nothing. You're empty. Which, and in that case, you're considering the will, and your conclusion is exactly correct. But it isn't the kind of I would say the most applicable and useful mode of self-reflection. Descartes says so I'll get there in a sec. Take a step back. If you want to know, if you want a report about the state of your soul, what's going to give you that information is passion, and not sort of active, ascetic self-reflection. You should be feeling passions. And Descartes notes that what does he say? The objects, the external objects, are the principal and most common causes of the passions. So, and this is to say something that you probably are already aware, that if you want to start thinking about yourself, experiencing something else is one of the best ways of doing that. I'm going to pour myself some rum. If you want to know who you are, maybe you shouldn't go off on a retreat. Maybe you should watch a good movie, read a good book, listen to some music, or indeed have a glass of something particularly nice. Because that will give you information on the state of your soul. So, I mean, let me go with this another direction. One of the things that irks me a lot in general discussion of alcoholic spirits is the attempt to distinguish, we over here, the good ones, from the alcoholics, the people with problems, by saying, well, we insist on drinking the good things, and they're the ones who don't care, who only drink the crap because they're addicted. This is bullshit. Like, this is just, everyone does this, and it's a total bullshit, and it annoys me. Like, ethanol does not care how much it costs. Like, it's how well it's been reviewed, how well it's been presented, nothing like that. It doesn't matter. And Descartes, and so that doesn't, like, there are lots of rich people who, I don't know, chug Camus or something and tell themselves that they don't have a problem, because if they had a problem, they would not be spending that much money on what they're drinking. So what's the difference? I mean, what is the difference between an enthusiast and an addict? I mean, I shouldn't have to put it like this because it's incredibly obvious, but an addict is someone who needs, to drink the thing. An enthusiast is someone who enjoys it. And the enjoyment is not about the thing. I mean, Descartes makes a point. I'm going to finally get to this text I've been wanting to get to. That the objects which stimulate the senses do not excite different passions enough because of differences in the objects, but because of the various ways in which they may harm or benefit us, or in general have importance for us. It's about our reaction. Everything here, this bottle, every bottle I've got over there, it's mostly just ethanol and water. There's no huge objective differences. Differences are in my reactions to them, the way I take them. It's a difference in taste, which is not to say it's all completely arbitrary. Taste isn't arbitrary, but it's not about the sort of physical facts of the thing. Sorry, I'm gone a little bit astray. I'm going to try to pull this back into order. So part of, I would say, the work of drinking well is reflective. Drinking is not just consuming this thing, and it's not just consuming this thing, however well reviewed it is or what. It's about the reflective work of experiencing oneself and one's passion and one's reaction to this thing, one's own personality. You can be with yourself with a glass of some decent spirit in a way that you can't be with yourself, with just sitting on the couch with nothing there, or in a retreat or something. The camera's acting up. And I think that kind of self-reflection is valuable and important. Self-reflection not as kind of ascetic meditation, but meditation against some external cause which excites a passion in us and which helps us to understand ourselves a little better and to train ourselves, to cultivate ourselves. And if you find yourself with a glass of whatever you got, no matter how nice it is, and you find yourself not doing that reflective work anymore, then you might need to be worried. But yeah, this is a much longer discussion. I don't want to go there. So that is why I find this late Descartes interesting, because he starts from this absolutely formalist, rationalist position, the I think, and finds at the end of his life that if you're talking about humanity, there's really nothing there. There's nothing there to that act of I doubt, I will, I think. What makes us human is our reaction to little things like this, and how well we can react to little things like this. That's all I got to say, I guess. I hope I halfway stuck the landing on that. Thanks for watching. Leave comments below whether I should do more of these or just stop and give up. Thanks for watching, and cheers.